Welcome back. It's time now for The World This Week. Coming up in this edition, tens of thousands of protesters marched through the Algerian capital, calling on the ailing president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, not to seek a fifth term in office in next month's elections. We'll be discussing that. Plus, at the end of a dramatic week of confrontation, Pakistan hands over an Indian pilot who was captured after his plane was shot down by the Pakistani military. We'll ask, has that situation now been diffused? And Muhammadu Buhari may have won a second term as Nigerian president, but he faces a daunting list of challenges. We'll be discussing a few of them, plus the much-anticipated second summit between the US President Donald Trump and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un came to an abrupt end on Thursday. Was it all a waste of time, and are we back to square one? Will there be a third summit? Well, I'll be putting some of those questions to our panel of guests today. I'm joined in the studio today by Judah Grunstein, who is the editor-in-chief of the World Politics Review. Welcome back to you. I'm joined by Wall Street Journal reporter Matthew Dalton. Welcome to you, Matthew. Leela Jacinto from France 24's International Affairs Desk is here with us too, as is the editor-in-chief of the Africa Report, Patrick Smith. Thank you very much indeed to all of you for being with us today. Now, the situation in Algeria is where we begin. Thousands of people have been taken to the streets in recent days. Those taking part are angered at plans for President Abdelaziz Bouteflika to seek a fifth term in office in next month's elections. But many of those taken to the streets aren't just angered at Bouteflika's bid to extend his 20-year tenure. They say they're angered by the system as a whole. Well, until now, political protests in the North African state have been extremely rare. Let's begin by talking about that situation, because Bouteflika turns 82 on Saturday. We understand he's celebrating his birthday at a clinic in Geneva. He's not a picture of good health. He's been in power for 20 years. He hasn't said a word in public for 6 years. Is he really in charge anyway?
No, I think the answer to that is a clear no, he's not in charge. A kind of cabal around him rules Algeria at the moment. The key person is his younger brother, Said Bouteflika. Around him are the various securocrats, the generals, the intelligence chiefs, and top business people, known collectively in Algeria as le pouvoir, the powers that be in the state. So what is interesting about these demonstrations, they're the biggest demonstrations Algiers, the capital, has seen, and cities like Constantine have seen for decades. I was talking to an Algerian friend this afternoon who said it could be a 1988 moment. And for those of you not steeped in Algerian history, that is the time when Algeria's whole system was challenged and they were forced to open up, liberalize the political system to have seriously open multi-party elections. I think what is happening is a frustration with the whole system, not just a political party. People say Bouteflika shouldn't stand, the FLN should get out of power, but it's a frustration with economic conditions. 45% of Algerians are under the age of 25. 30% of those Algerians don't have jobs or any prospect of getting them in the near future. There's massive discontent and frustration with the way the system's running. What they see is this sort of oligarchy at the top that is opaque and secretive and controlling all the hydrocarbon money, all the oil and gas money, and not sharing it out with the rest of the population.
Yeah, and those protests have been brewing pretty much the whole week, haven't they? It's not. It looks like it's getting into something pretty big there, Judah.
Well, it's hard to. It's impossible to predict where it goes. I think the things that jump out at me most is that it's a real condemnation of a system when the best hope for stability is an individual who is really not really in control of his own faculties, let alone the country. The idea that having a puppet in the seat of power is the best solution to actually resolving some of the power struggles and the clan issues in terms of leadership shows that the system hasn't prepared for any succession. It hasn't prepared for any stability or transition.
Which is surprising, given the age of the man. 82 on Saturday. I mean, he's not a spring chicken, is he?
But because of the competing centers for power, and also Algeria's particular history with the civil war. When we saw the Arab uprisings in 2011, a lot of people said that Algeria was in some ways inoculated by the trauma of having seen what happens when a protest movement or a contestation of power goes too far because of the civil war that followed. And so at the time, there was still a huge amount of revenues from oil and gas. Those have disappeared with the collapse in the price of energy. And so the government hasn't been able to pacify the people by buying them out. And I think one last thought is that you see a much younger cohort in the streets, people who don't necessarily have the same memory or the same trauma from the Civil War and aren't therefore silenced or prevented from coming out to express the dissatisfaction. And again, it's not another endless term issue as we see elsewhere in Africa. It's really, I think, the fact that there's something almost comical about Bouteflika seeking another term when he's clearly not in power and he's not there.
Yeah, I think the youth is really important because, I mean, right now he's an octogenarian and he actually has to be strapped onto his wheelchair. But he was a very wily politician. And, he's credited for bringing this atrocious war in the 1990s, the conflict, to an end. And he did that by being able to play all the players and have a referendum. But this makes no difference to younger people who were born after the years or the years of lead, année de plomb, as they call it. So this is why we are seeing something. But for Algerians of the generation that lived through those years, there is really a sense that Bouteflika was the only one who could bring this stability. Now this is all completely blown up, and your analogy with 1988 is very interesting because on Sunday, the Constitutional Court will have to officially the candidates officially given their applications. In 1990s, the whole conflagration happened because this court did not allow an Islamist party to contest the election. That's the pouvoir at play, where even the justice system is very much not independent. So, I mean, Algeria has always been a shadowy country, but right now having a near-dead president being controlled by his managers makes it bizarre. It's almost surreal.
Yeah, this is a country that the Arab Spring largely passed by. I mean, there was very little instability, and it's also a country that's an important counterterrorism partner to France, in particular in Europe, but to Europe more generally speaking. It's got a major role in keeping controlling the flow of migrants from Africa to Europe. So if instability and Libya. So if this country political instability starts to become a serious problem in Algeria, it's going to have a serious blowback effect on Europe potentially.
You've got to look at the coverage it's getting in the French media. If you look at this afternoon's Le Monde, it's I think about 10 pages on Algeria. Yeah. And of course, it was only 2 years ago, Emmanuel Macron, in one of his political campaigns for the presidency, made a formal apology to Algeria for French behavior during the anti-colonial war and so on. So it's a country that's very, very close to the heart of the French political system as well, for all the reasons you've made clear. Yeah. And I think people are watching it very closely.
Right, and there were only Algerian jihadists and Islamist militants who conducted attacks on French soil. None of the other groups in Africa, in the Sahel, have actually launched attacks outside Africa. Algeria is absolutely critical. It is the bridge into the Sahel region and very close to France.
And those groups have also been responsible for inspiring a lot of French extremists, French jihadists to conduct attacks. And so if that situation gets out of control, it's going to be a security concern for France, no doubt.
Yeah, certainly those protests today these protests have been much bigger than other ones earlier on in the week. And, there are reports of tear gas and so on being used in clashes.
But I mean, what amazes me is that there's been the opposition hasn't managed to put forward one candidate who is strong enough. Well, it's so fractured that they can't seem to agree on an opposition candidate. And now we have an 82-year-old man standing for his fifth term.
Symptomatic of a lot of politics in a lot of places. But I mean, what people are saying, there's no real leadership to these protests. I mean, they are literally a popular movement of the sort of movement we saw in Sudan in December, which is now getting stronger and stronger. And it's actually catching the opposition groups unaware. I mean, the Algerian leftists, the trades unions are kind of caught between this. There's a sort of center-left feeling about the Algerian government. No one knows. The Islamists are pretty marginalized after the end of the civil war. Bouteflika's sort of signal, reconciliation plans and all the rest of it proved successful. So I think it's almost like an apolitical opposition. They want a change in the socio-economic system as much as they do want to see the back of the FLN.
One thing I was going to add is that if you look at the regional picture, the narrative is that there was the Arab uprisings and then they were basically quashed, and that's in the past. Mark Lynch, who's a Middle East analyst in the U.S., he proposed that we might actually be seeing the Arab uprisings 2.0 hiding in plain sight. You have the protests in Algeria. There have been a lot of protests in the Reef section in Morocco, Sudan as well. Egypt has seen anti-austerity protests even under the dictatorship of Sisi. So there's a lot of widespread common themes, obviously not nothing that's going transnational right now, but a lot of common themes that we saw last in 2011. And
that's a theme, in fact, the Algerian Prime Minister picked up on and said to people, be careful, this could turn out to be like the Arab Spring. We might end up being like Syria, implying that this could unlock a whole sort of civil war in Algeria. Let's move on, though, because all of this week we've been keeping a very close eye on what appears to have been the most serious confrontation in years between nuclear-armed neighbours India and Pakistan. Tensions have been running particularly high since Tuesday, when Indian aircraft crossed into Pakistan and carried out what was described as a preemptive strike against the militant group Jaish-e-Mohammed, which is blamed for the February 14th suicide bombing in Indian-controlled Kashmir. 40 Indian troops were killed in that attack. Well, Pakistan then retaliated, shooting down 2 Indian aircraft on Wednesday and capturing a pilot. Well, that pilot was freed on Friday, released and returned to India. Leela, let me start with you, because we've been talking about this together this week on this very set. Just how dangerous did this situation get?
The situation got extremely dangerous. These are 2 nuclear-powered nations. They have fought 3 conventional wars, and a proxy war continues. What has happened is that Prime Minister Imran Khan, Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan, who is a man on this platform that I have warned about, really stepped up his diplomatic game. And what we saw right now, the freeing of the captured Indian pilot, there has been some level of de-escalation in tensions that were really very high. But, de-escalation is not resolution. So for now, we have gotten over the worst. But, the Kashmir crisis is long-standing. It involves India, Pakistan, 2 nuclear nations, and it also affects the security of Afghanistan and the US. And this is not the end of the problems that we are going to see.
Okay, but it appears, doesn't it, that we're back from the brink, let's say in the middle of the week.
It appears so, and thankfully and hopefully that continues to be the case. The issue with nuclear weapons, again, is that they have a stabilizing effect and a destabilizing effect. They have a stabilizing effect in the sense that 2 nuclear armed powers that are hostile toward each other will seek to avoid confrontation and conflict, and when it arises, there's a real pressure to contain it and to de-escalate. The problem is that we're human beings, and the most logical and calm minds don't necessarily win out in arguments when passions are inflamed the way they were last week. So that's where it becomes very dangerous and destabilizing. I think the things that jump out at me about this story are the facts on the ground in Kashmir, and then the broader circumstances. So the broader circumstances is that nuclear balance and the nuclear deterrence. The facts on the ground in Kashmir are that things have been changing there. There's been a lot of violent protests, a lot of very repressive measures by the Indian forces, and a localization of the militancy and the armed resistance to Indian occupation over the last few years. And JEM has been a little sidelined by what's been going on, and I think that's the context that explains why they engaged in this attack. And then beyond that, you have Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, who's facing a re-election and couldn't really afford to not do anything especially since India has shown a lot of restraint in the past in the face of terrorist attacks. And across the border in Pakistan, there's a government and a security apparatus that, take your pick, either directs, supports, tolerates, or ignores the presence of a terrorist group on its territory that has caused a lot of pain and suffering and death in India. And that's simply intolerable. No government and no state can tolerate that. And the international community really shouldn't either, and has been pressuring Pakistan. But again, like Algeria, Pakistan is a very significant and important country for regional stability and containing various conflicts, such as in Afghanistan. So they've kind of gotten a free pass on some of this stuff with regard to India. And what you said about resolution, that's far from achieved until Pakistan really addresses that issue.
Well, I mean, there are two things to be addressed. One, and the central one, is Pakistan's use of proxy Islamist groups, which the military uses. There is some sense, out of these nationalist fringes, that a lot of Pakistani civilians are getting growingly alarmed of the use of Pakistani soil for militant groups, including groups that are now attacking Iran. So there is a sentiment in the civilian sections that this game is getting too dangerous to play, but it continues to be a tool for the Pakistani military. On the other hand is, of course, the domestic situation in Kashmir. Now, on both fronts, New Delhi has not played has not had really foresight in its policy. Narendra Modi is playing to his right-wing nationalist base. And so at this point of time, he's not going to reopen negotiations. And in terms of, convincing the Pakistani military, as difficult as it is, to stop playing this proxy war, what has to be done is that India has to make Pakistan feel a lot less insecure. And the way this conflict blew out. It was not just a military conflict. It was a conflict on the media, hyper-nationalists on both sides. This is absolutely not a theater in which there is any grounds for scaling down, for starting a long-term process. So we are stuck in this for a while.
Could I
You wanted to just jump in? Sorry, let me give Matthew a chance Patrick a chance to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I just on the possible resolution. I mean, there's a move to try and get Jaish-e-Mohammed proscribed and its leader proscribed by the UN in the Security Council. So far, China has blocked that for reasons of its bilateral relations with Pakistan. I think it might be the moment when they could step up pressure on that. I mean, I thought it was very interesting the fact that Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince visited both Pakistan and India. And you've got this meeting of the Islamic Conference this weekend, and Pakistan is boycotting that because India has sent a representative there who used the occasion of his platform to condemn countries that hosted terrorist organizations. So I think you've got some diplomatic momentum building that India could take care of.
And different diplomatic players, not the US. Yeah.
Sorry to cut you short. We're going to have to take a short break. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. The World This Week will continue. Welcome back. The World This Week continues here on France 24. Just before the break, we were talking about the brinkmanship between India and Pakistan, a situation which appears, at least for the time being, to have been resolved. Well, at least we're back from the brink. I think we've all agreed. Judah, just before we pause for the break, we were going to talk a little bit about what role the international community has played in trying to sort of defuse that situation. What are your thoughts?
Well, one of the problems is that there's not a whole lot of countries in the world that have leverage with both sides, essentially. And also that India historically has maintained that Kashmir is a bilateral issue, and they don't want to internationalize it in terms of an international conference or mediation effort. In the past, the U.S. has played a major role in shuttle diplomacy in 2001, for instance. And a lot of people that have criticized the American, tolerance of some of Pakistan's worst behavior with regard to Afghanistan, even, or the terrorist groups targeting India, The problem with essentially choosing a side in this conflict is that you have the nuclear threat at all times, and when that starts becoming relevant or dangerous, you have to have someone who has good ties and good contacts with both sides. And one of the things that we've seen with the current U.S. administration is that a little bit distracted this week. B, you have a lot of desks that are empty in terms of ambassadorships and in terms of the relevant desks at the Defense Department. You have an acting Secretary of Defense, Patrick Shanahan, who's got a long history of managing a business with Boeing, but no history at all in terms of international affairs or relationships. So he doesn't have a Rolodex. He doesn't have people to call or relationships or chips to cash in on. So right now, it seems like the two sides have backed off. I agree that Imran Khan showed a lot of leadership. In that kind of situation, both sides have to do something. The Indian side could not sit by and allow that kind of attack. And once they had attacked Pakistani soil, the Pakistanis had to respond. So now it seems like they've gotten that out of their system. They've both reestablished their freedom of maneuver. I don't know how much the American mediation might have played, what role it played in calming things down. But for now, the capability for mediating is dramatically reduced compared to the past.
Yeah, I mean, the Pakistani foreign minister sounded quite sort of conciliatory with the handover of that captured Indian pilot. He said this was a gesture of peace. But the defense minister of Pakistan, Pervez Khattak, said that Islamabad will give India, and I quote, a memorable response if it attacks Pakistan again. I mean, next time around, things might not end this way, mightn't they? I mean, there must be a good deal of concern about how things could have turned out this time around and how they might turn out in the event of another confrontation.
Both sides will keep the rhetoric. And in India, too, Narendra Modi made no address to the nation. Imran Khan made two addresses he made one address to the nation, one offer at a joint session of parliament. Narendra Modi is a man who's not known for keeping silent, had maintained a radio silence. He continued with his campaign rallies, which showed a complete lack of leadership. So the Indian side too, is trying to spin this as a victory, even though honestly this whole thing was sparked by Indian security failures. The attack in Kashmir, which killed more than 40 Indian soldiers in a highly secured zone. There were intelligence failures that led to it. That has to be seen. The back and forth of the military tit for tat. The Indian airstrikes did not really do their job. There is growing evidence that in fact there were some pine trees that were shot. So I mean, both sides, India and Pakistan, are going to have spin this as their respective victories, but still keep the rhetoric of they will be punished. That will not change.
Okay, well, let's move on now. Thanks for that, Leela. Let's move on to our third topic. The United States has congratulated Nigeria for what it called a successful election this week. The result of that vote sees President Muhammadu Buhari re-elected for a second term in office. He clinched about 56% of the vote to 41% for his closest challenger in the form of Atiku Abubakar. Well, Buhari has promised to focus his efforts on security, the economy, and cracking down on corruption during these next 4 years that he's in that top job. Let's start with you, Matthew. It wasn't an entirely smooth election, was it? It's surprising that the United States should be calling it such a successful election, given that there were deaths along the way and there was violence.
Well, yeah, you can look at it in two ways: glass half full, glass half empty. Glass half full. There wasn't too much violence. The election instability didn't last for too long, or so far anyway. And now Buhari seems to be that result is going to stand. But if you look at it compared to, in particular, the last election when Buhari defeated his predecessor, Goodluck Jonathan, it was actually quite a historic election. It was one of the first democratic transfers in power. I believe the first democratic transfer of power in Nigeria's history. It happened relatively peacefully. This time around, there were more than 30 people killed, protests. The result was not accepted in the way it was 4 years ago. This is Nigeria is a very important country for regional stability, for African stability. It's it's Africa's biggest oil producer, and it's fighting an Islamist insurgency coming from its northern areas, a vital counterterrorism partner for the West, particularly the United States. So the fact that they couldn't, this election didn't go quite as smoothly as it should have, is you can see it as a blow for democracy in Nigeria and also for Africa more generally.
Patrick, let me turn to you. You are, of course, the editor or editor-in-chief of the Africa Report. I mean, was that electoral victory deserved by Buhari, do you think?
Well, there are big questions. One of the big questions is 35% turnout. That's a lot lower. Fewer people participated in the election this time around, although there were another 15 million people on the voters' register than they did in 2015. So there's a concern about the very low turnout. It's dominated by old men. The two candidates are septuagenarian men. And given the fact that Nigerian women play such a key role in the economy of the country, they're totally underrepresented in the political system. So there's a lot of frustration with the political system, just in terms of the statistics that have come out from the official Electoral Commission. But there are a lot of questions also about the manner of the election, the technical failures with the card reading system. They've got this very complex, state-of-the-art biometric registration and card reader system to verify and all the votes. And it kept on breaking down. So they reverted to manual verification and all the dodginess that goes with that and so on. There was a lot of, in some of the opposition areas, for example, the security forces were very active. They were moving in areas and people felt intimidated. So they've got a lot of complaints. I think what it's going to boil down to is this concept of, was it qualitatively right and was it quantitatively right? Now, it may be with a margin like 4 million, you can say that opposition are never going to prove that every one of those 4 million votes was stolen. But if you want to look at the quality of the election, and did it infringe the Constitution in terms of being a free and fair expression generally of Nigerian citizens' political wishes? I think the opposition may be on stronger ground to press their case. So I think it's not done and dusted, but it's a question also of how the judges react.
Judah.
We have a contributor at WPR, Alex Thurston, who wrote our pre-election run-up analysis, and then on his own blog mentioned that if there was fraud in the election, it was very crafty.
Yeah.
Because there were maybe some eyebrow raisers in the areas where Buhari was supposed to win in terms of maybe wider margins than people would expect. In the areas where he wasn't expected to do well, he didn't do that well.
Yeah.
So there was maybe some eyebrow raisers, maybe some head scratchers, but no real eye-rubbing, this is not credible. I think one of the things that, again, strikes me about this election, we talked about it already in Algeria. Buhari was elected on a platform of anti-corruption and security. The Boko Haram insurgency there was a point where it had been diminished, but it's now bounced back in the past year. The security forces have engaged in abusive behavior, some atrocities and things of that nature. And corruption is still just as bad a problem in Nigeria as it ever has been. And so I think what's most dangerous about this kind of election, once we get past the question of whether it sticks and whether is that there's very clear popular yearning for an end to corruption and to security. And the government and the ruling class, because like you said, they're two 70-year-old guys running for office, they're widely known. They've been fixtures on the Nigerian political scene for years. The opposition, Abu Bakr, was blocked from entering the United States at one point because of corruption allegations. So obviously a poor candidate to run. But the point being that you have this popular yearning and these political systems that aren't satisfying those. We see it here in the West as well. We see it in Europe. We see it in the U.S. And I think that's really, when you pull a real broad pullback and you look at what's going on in the world today, you have climate change and you have that. The fact that people are not getting what they expect and what they're clearly expressing they want from their political class and from their governments and from the ruling classes or governing classes.
I should also mention that Nigeria had this was kind of challenging terrain for an election this time around because there was a widespread belief in Nigeria for a while that Buhari was actually the person that was appearing in public claiming to be Buhari was not actually Buhari, that it was a body double of some kind of like Dave, that movie Dave, where the American president dies and he's replaced by somebody who looks exactly like him. And so at some point, Buhari felt it necessary to go on television and deny that this was happening.
We do get that quite often as well.
He spent months abroad for medical treatment.
It's a recurrent theme in international
We've got Dave in
relations, that one.
Nigeria and a weekend at Bernie's in Algeria.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about the economy too much, though. And, Buhari's opponent in that election, Abu Bakr, really was campaigning on an economic platform. And, there's a lot to be done there. I mean, Nigeria is extremely dependent on oil revenue and not a lot else. And that's one of the things, isn't it, that Buhari in his second term has really got to address, is this diversification of the economy away from oil and onto other things.
Well, I mean, the fall in the oil prices did not help Buhari, to be fair. And his opponent, of course, was as a businessman and was pushing for more privatized, business-friendly economic policies. But I mean, what always strikes me about Nigeria is this constant statement that, Nigeria is Africa's biggest market. But it's just a big population. If they don't start getting their economy together, getting their corruption together, what's the point of just, constantly touting this Africa's biggest market?
It's a great example of the meaningless of gross domestic product, of a measure of economies, because you've got 200 million people in the country, and every time they go out and buy recharge their cell phones, that's another whatever, $5 on the GDP. It's sort of meaningless. It's a classic example. I mean, Nigeria was growing over the last 20 years, an average of 5 to 6%. It's now slowed down to under 2%. But in that period of 5 to 6%, it was jobless growth, and you've got this.
Nigerians they're not feeling any of
that's the core thing that Buhari and Atiku, if he had been elected, would have to face. So I think absolutely, he's got to come up and speed up the diversification. They have done something in the north, for example, on the agriculture. I mean, certainly Nigeria's local staples production, rice, millet, maize, has gone up appreciably under Buhari. But that's not sort of headline stuff, to be honest. And it's not felt in the urban centres very much of the country. But yeah, I mean, it's all to play for. He's got no excuse now not to deliver. He's got a majority in the National Assembly, a majority in the Senate. He's got a thumping victory in the presidential elections. Buhari has to deliver. There's no option. Otherwise, he's not going to have much of a legacy.
Okay, let's move on to our final topic, the much-anticipated second summit between the US President Donald Trump and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, which came to a rather abrupt end on Thursday. It's understood there was a disagreement over just how much sanction relief Washington should give Pyongyang in return for steps towards nuclear disarmament. Well, President Trump then cancelled the lunch that had been scheduled. He boarded Air Force One and flew 13,000 kilometers back to Washington, deprived of a badly needed triumph. Well, he declared that he prefers no deal to a bad deal. Why don't we start with you, Judah? You've been rather quiet for the last couple of minutes. It does seem very strange, doesn't it, for a US president to go all that way to meet another head of state, when the deal hasn't been stitched up.
Well, this was the novelty of Trump's approach to North Korea. Instead of working through the working level negotiations that often take years, we saw it with the Iran nuclear deal, for instance, that require really digging into all of these complicated details. And then finally, when you have an agreement pretty much ready to sign, maybe you need to dot some I's and cross some T's and figure out some wording here or there, but the document's ready to be signed. And only then do you lend the prestige of the office of the United States president to a summit. Now, in all fairness, that hasn't worked with North Korea. And so Trump decided Trump had the I don't even know what to call it, an urge to just cut through that. There's a lot of showmanship involved. He loved the headlines and the global coverage, the fact that no one talked about anything else during the first summit in Singapore. But the idea is, look, we're not making any progress the normal way, so let's cut through this. Between the two leaders, we'll establish a relationship of trust, and then maybe with that trust, similar to the idea that India and Pakistan needs to feel more secure. If I can make this guy feel more secure, maybe he'd be more willing to give up his nuclear weapons. The problem with that approach is that everyone who studies North Korea and studies their nuclear program and studies the language that they use to negotiate pretty much unanimously understood that North Korea is not going to disarm. They're not going to give up their nuclear weapons. Their nuclear weapons are an insurance policy against the United States. And in fact, the only time that they were taken seriously to this level in international diplomacy was when they had basically completed their nuclear program in terms of having warheads and having ICBMs to deliver them to the American mainland. And so given that that was what pretty much everyone understood, there was a lot of confusion in the run-up from the disconnect between the declarative policy of the U.S., which remained the irreversible, permanent, and complete denuclearization of North Korea, and the fact that Kim was basically offering an India deal or a Pakistan deal. Look, you'll recognize us as a nuclear armed state, and we'll moderate our behavior, and we'll be a little less provocative. And our confidence building measure is that we've stopped tests, and now we want some sanctions relief to go further. Now, the gestures that he talked about were not disarmament or denuclearization. They were basically shuttering one section of a facility that produces their fissile material for their bombs. He wasn't talking about eliminating warheads. He wasn't talking about an inventory of what they have or plans and sites. There's not that level of trust yet, and they don't have any intention. Maybe they'll let go of some warheads, but they're not going to let go of all of them. And so the question for me going into the summit was essentially, is the U.S. going to recognize North Korea as a nuclear state and agree that if you moderate your behavior and do not threaten us, we'll allow that and help you develop and try to bring you in from the cold? That obviously wasn't the outcome of this summit.
I think there was a lot of relief after this internationally from U.S. partners and from people in the U.S. government, because there was a concern going in that Trump, in his eagerness for a deal, was going to give something to North Korea like international recognition or agree to lift some portion of sanctions without getting this, some kind of sense of not just what's happening at that main facility, but also the drawdown of weapons activities at other facilities, at secret facilities. And the fact that Trump did not give him anything like that, understood, midway through the talks that wasn't going to happen. Probably better than for him to just cut his losses, get on the plane, and head home, rather than run the risk of agreeing to something that a lot of people would regret later.
I guess the FT had it right. That at the end of it, the world wasn't a more dangerous place, so the worst was averted, as you said. It wasn't a giveaway on either side. Mm-hmm. So there was some sort of stasis at the end of it. Okay. But it is a remarkable event that all that money and all that effort invested in this summit and nothing comes out of it. It's pretty mind blowing.
I think Kim took a 2-day train ride from
from 2.5 days.
He is on a state visit to Hanoi now, so I guess he's got something out of it. I mean,
some people saying he's come out stronger.
Some people say that he has, he played Trump to a degree. He knew I know we're not going to talk about it, but he knew that the Michael Cohen hearings were going on, and while this was playing, Trump is going to be completely distracted. And he did the whole, timed the whole Korea thing as a diversion, a distraction from that, perhaps. So you've got a situation where the North Koreans. Well, what have we got to lose? We're going to come out of this just by having the summit. We come out of it looking better, more respectable, and stronger on the international stage. Let alone how it's played domestically.
The real problem is that you have Donald Trump and a reality TV show and this basically empty theater of diplomacy around an issue that is really important and really significant and really difficult. Now, so it's very. I mean, the jokes write themselves, right? With regard to Trump and Kim and this idea of who's playing who and what have you. At the same time, I think that I agree there was a lot of relief that Trump walked away from the table, but it doesn't remove this fundamental problem, which is that strategic patience didn't work, which was the Obama administration's sense that, listen, we're not going to negotiate when they're not serious. We'll wait them out. That didn't work. They got nuclear weapons in the meantime. Fire and fury didn't work because they got ICBMs in the meantime. The sanctions level has been ramped up to unprecedented degree, but the global consensus about who is the dangerous party in this conflict at this point has shifted. China is less willing to really clamp down than they were 6 months ago or 9 months ago. Russia also. So I think that there's a lot of there's been a shift in the ground in terms of whether how North Korea is perceived and how North Korea as a nuclear armed state is perceived, the degree to which that is perceived as a threat. And I think that fundamentally there's no way to disarm North Korea. And a U.S. policy that only disarmed North Korea will resolve this conflict is holding on to something that's no longer realistic. And so I agree that it's not necessarily, there's no guarantee of safety in the event that you accept that. But I don't see any other outcome to this unless the idea that continued sanctions that North Korea has played successfully for the last 10 years are a solution.
And particularly without China on the side of trying to bring North Korea to the table and putting pressure on them. I mean, the United States' very difficult relationship and Trump's very difficult relationship with China right now is definitely not helping matters. And I think, everybody understands that if North Korea is really going to be pressured to do something, China has to be fully on board with it and, clamping down on trade and North Korean exports. And that is, I don't think we can really count on that at all, given the current situation between the U.S. and China.
One analyst described this as being one of the most high-profile diplomatic collapses in recent years. I mean, that's not particularly complimentary, but do you think there's any truth in that, or is that a massive exaggeration?
No, it seems about right. I can't think of a summit, the Singapore summit perhaps excepted, where, a president has gone in as badly prepared as Donald Trump went in to see this and been comprehensively outmaneuvered. But as I said, it plays well for North Korea. I don't think it plays so well for the U.S. The only thing you can say is that it didn't end a lot worse, and there were all sorts of opportunities for either a giveaway or a contretemps on either side, and flouncing out. It was a sort of agreeable walkout, I guess.
I don't want to draw the parallel too strongly, but there was a precedent in terms of the Reykjavik summit between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev,
1987,
where Reagan actually proposed to Gorbachev that, hey, why don't we get rid of them all? We'll get rid of all the nuclear weapons. And his aides were absolutely horrified and scrambled to sort of contain the damage. Gorbachev didn't know whether to take him seriously or not. And the only thing that stood in the way was that Reagan wouldn't let go of Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, the anti-missile, space-based anti-missile program that was a pipe dream anyway. So they didn't follow through on the deal. To everyone's relief, the summit was considered something of a fiasco. But what grew out of it was the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which the U.S. just withdrew from. But that is sort of considered one of the first steps towards the end of the Cold War. So I would say that certainly Trump's unorthodox style makes it hard to judge the success or failure of the summit. Both sides for now seem to be leaving open the possibility of further negotiations. And I think there's a little wrestling match going on over whose narrative about the failure wins out. But there's still, I still think there's room for more talks and more diplomacy.
We have room for 30 seconds.
We have to give Trump some benefit of the doubt. I mean, this did not end up as badly as it could have, and it did not end as badly as it was in Singapore. As you say, North Korea is not giving up its nuclear arms. So at least we are not in the state of belligerence right now. Both parties have still left it open. So it's status quo, but it's not a dangerous status quo.
At least they're still both saying nice things about each other.
They are. We're not back to Rocket
we have
Man.
officially lowered the bar about as low as we can go.
Rocket Man and Dotard, we'll have to put them to one side. We'll forget about those. I wanted to ask you whether there'll be a third summit, and if so, what the venue might be. But I'm being told we're completely out of time. That was The World This Week. Leela, Jacinto from our International Affairs Desk, you had the last word. Thank you very much to you, Matthew Dalton from the Wall Street Journal. Thank you to you, Patrick Smith, the Editor-in-Chief of the Africa Report. And last but not least, thank you very much indeed, Judah Grunstein, Editor-in-Chief of the World Politics Review. That was The World This Week.